Hello, I'm Mally Shantzfeld, Managing Editor of Endodontic Practice US, Implant Practice US, and Orthodontic Practice US, Medmark publications. Welcome to a live presentation and question and answer with Chip Fichtner. In our webinar today, we will be exploring the landscape of dental businesses in respect to dental support organizations, DSOs, including the specific risks and rewards of choosing a DSO partner. We will also be sharing the state of market consolidation during and after COVID-19. For this webinar, the CE Learning objectives are understanding the changes in dental support organizations in the last 180 days, realizing the effects of COVID-19 on dental practices, learning the tax implications of the upcoming election, discovering what buyers and partners want, what they don't want, and why, reviewing benefits to selling all or part and staying to grow, and discerning real transaction values, not appraised values. Before we get started, I would like to invite viewers to use the question box in your control panel to ask any questions, and your questions will be answered at the end of the session. Also, associated with this presentation is a free CE quiz. At the end of the webinar, we will email all attendees instructions on how to access the CE quiz. I'm pleased to introduce our guest for today, Chip Fichtner, co-founder of Large Practice Sales, which has created over $200 million in value for dentists of all specialties in the last year. After careers at Merrill Lynch and Bear Stearns, Chip began buying and selling businesses of all types for his own portfolio. He has been the chairman or CEO of multiple publicly traded companies and has presented at conferences on investing and marketing from Hong Kong to Monaco. He has been featured in numerous media outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, CNBC, Money Magazine, and of course, Cosmopolitan when he was single. Chip, we turn the webinar over to you to learn more about our topic for today.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And thank you, doctors, for joining us today in the middle of your day. It's typical for us that we would do these in the evenings, and I'm excited that we have a couple hundred people registered for this today in the middle of the day, and it's Thursday. So thank you for being here. This should only take about 4 hours, and we have 437 slides to go through, and it should be an interesting and educational presentation, and I'm kidding about the length and the slides. Real value in these webinars, frankly, comes in the questions at the end. There is a dialog box that you can enter your questions, and we will do our best to answer all of them. And worst case, if we don't get to all of them, feel free to contact us directly, and there will be an email address to reach me. And we're happy to talk about your individual situation. And as I tell every doctor that I talk to, it never hurts to learn what your practice could be worth in one of these transactions. Our specialty is selling parts of larger practices to what we call invisible DSOs. An invisible DSO is a term that we coined, and it is designed to describe groups of partially owned practices in which the prospective partner does not change the name of the group and does not tell the doctor what to do, and each and every one of them are run by the partner doctor. The invisible DSO model is built on the theory and the proven fact that practices in which the doctor retains ownership perform better than practices in which you have employee doctors. Owners pay more attention, they care about the outcome because they're getting a percentage of the profits. And so the whole invisible DSO model, which we'll go into in more detail in a few minutes, is all about having silent partners that invest in great practices, and their goal is to support those practices to help them grow bigger, better, faster, and more profitably. But their goal in their business model is not to tell the doctor what to do or how to run his practice. They want the doctors to retain ownership and retain leadership of the practice. And frankly, they don't want to break what they just spent millions of dollars buying. So a lot of doctors are very concerned about, gee whiz, if I join with an invisible DSO, are they going to tell me what to do every day, what insurances to take, what color to paint my lobby, when to be open, and who to hire and fire and what to pay them? And the answer is no, that is not what they do. They are counting on you as an owner to do that. Quickly, this is what we're going to go through in the next 45 minutes or so. One of the questions we always get from doctors is real estate issues. If I own my practice, property, how am I impacted? And the answer we'll get to in a second. But the good news is, it's a good thing for you and you have multiple choices. So let's talk about the invisible DSO concept. Typically, an invisible DSO will buy anywhere between 60 and 90% of a practice for cash up front, and the doctor will retain ownership either at the practice level, the parent level, or a combination of both. The interesting thing about these groups is while they can be very supportive, they can also be very dangerous. As an example, we sold an orthodontic practice in Indiana last year. It was a relatively small town. There were a total of 5 orthos in town. And an invisible DSO owned the 5 largest pediatric practices in town, which were not referring to our client. As a part of the transaction, this group bought 70% of our client for cash, and they started referring all 1,500 of their ortho cases coming out of their pediatric practices to him. And what happened is that means the other 4 orthos in town are now no longer getting those 1,500 ortho cases that they were getting for the last 10 or 15 years. And so when an invisible DSO comes to your town, they can change the dynamics of businesses throughout the dental system very significantly. Doesn't always happen, but we're doing a series of transactions in a western state for a single invisible DSO where the group is buying pedos, orthos, and oral surgeons, and that's it. And in the last, let's call it from September 15th to December 31, they will have gone from 0 offices in this state to over 40 offices in this state. So in a 95-day period, the marketing dynamics within that state are going to change dramatically as it pertains to pedo, ortho, and oral surgery. And that happens in other specialties and in GP as well. One of the drums that I have been beating since Biden was named the presumptive candidate is that taxes are going up next year. Frankly, it doesn't matter who's elected because taxes are going up next year because there are a lot of deficits in state budgets, and obviously there is a massive federal bailout that somebody's going to have to pay for. And unfortunately, somebody is the high-income dentists are going to get to pay for it. And so this is a real-world example of what potentially happens to your value if Biden's proposed tax increase is passed, which is to eliminate the long-term capital gains tax provision. We get a lot of doctors who say, yeah, that's okay. I can't worry about that. So I'm just going to keep growing my practice. Well, even if you grew your practice 25%, the bottom line by 25% next year, after taxes, you're still going to get less money than if you sold prior to the tax increase. So functionally, you would work an extra year, generate more ordinary income, but ultimately your net proceeds from one of these transactions, net after tax, is going to be lower. So something to keep in mind. This is a slide from the first version of this webinar that I did 18 months ago. And the reason this slide is in here is not just because I'm a boat guy, but people like looking at a $300 million boat. This boat happened to be at the Monaco Boat Show in September of 2018. That boat sold at the show the first day. It sold to a member of the Walmart family. It then went into the shop and they spent $35 million redecorating it, and the boat was brand new. It had never been used. The point of this story is I went to the broker who sold this, and it's very rare to see a $300 million boat sell the first day of the Monaco Boat Show. And I asked the broker, I said, what's going on? And he said, well, it's kind of interesting. The very rich people are trying to get liquid right now. They believe that the economy is going to change. Now, that is not him saying that COVID was coming, but it was him saying that the multi-billionaires that are the guys who buy these kind of boats were interested in getting liquid. A little bit about us. This has been a very interesting period for us during COVID. My original belief on mid-March was that COVID was going to murder our business, and the opposite actually happened. When businesses shut down on whatever it was, March the 15th, we'll call it, the larger DSOs, and when I say larger, these are the groups that own interest in 100, 200, 300, 400 practices across the country, they went into triage mode to focus on the shutdown of their practices. The smaller groups, the newer groups who had fresh equity capital, and we'll talk about where that equity comes from in a minute, got very aggressive, and they started eagerly trying to partner with our clients. And so our 2020 transaction volumes will probably be a little bit over double what it was in 2019, which frankly was a phenomenal year for us and for our clients, and we're high values. Today, because of the advent of multiple new DSOs getting into the business of partnering primarily with specialists, most of the new DSOs that have been formed in the last, call it year, are very specialist focused. So there are groups that are buying endo only, and that has changed dramatically. 2 years ago, there were no endo only groups. Today, there are at least 8 that we know of that are only interested in buying endodontic practices. Some of them are regional, some of them are national, but the key to getting value in endo at the moment is to get a multiple buyer bidding war, and that ends up creating value for our clients. Orthodontics, there have been numerous ortho specialty only buyer groups out there for at least 5 years, the most famous of which would be Smile Brands, which is headquartered in Texas, who went from 2 offices to about 200 offices in about 5 short years. And that is also now true in oral surgery. There are multiple groups that buy oral surgery only. Some of them are national, some of them are regional. Some of them have been around 2 years, and some of them were formed last week. So it's a very dynamic market, which is a great thing for doctors because it means they have more prospective partners to choose from in this process. And one of the great things about this process is it's kind of like getting married, because ultimately when you do an invisible DSO transaction, you're signing up for a long-term relationship with your new partner. And so our belief is that doctors are best served by dating multiple potential partners, and prior to deciding which one they may want to marry, which is not necessarily the one providing the highest value or the most cash up front, it's ultimately about a long-term relationship. And so as a part of that process, when you choose one that you think you want to get married to, before you become engaged, you're going to meet the family, which means in our process, we're going to introduce you to other doctors that have done these transactions with the specific partner that you think you want to get married to. And we call it the meet the family process. You want to understand who you're prospectively getting married to. The reason I put the large ortho practice in Hawaii on March 31st is it was in the early days of COVID, and frankly, Hawaii is probably the hardest place to sell a practice in the country. Alaska is easier. Most of the invisible DSOs are not interested in Hawaii, but we found one who was, and that's kind of what our specialty is helping to achieve extraordinary values for our clients by doing things creatively. As an example, the $60 million in transaction we closed in September, the majority of those were orthospedos and oral surgeons in a specific region to a single buyer. And they probably got a value anywhere between 30 and 60% above market value, because we had a single buyer who wanted to buy all 3 of those specialties in the same area, and we were able to assemble a great group for them. The world is changing. How it's going to change, I don't know. How much money is going to be pumped into the system by the feds, I don't know. But these 2 guys are both very wealthy, successful prognosticators, and they believe that the world is going to be different and that we haven't seen the beginning of it yet. One of the interesting things that we're seeing in the COVID era is that we're seeing a lot more earnouts. An earnout basically says, look, we're going to overlook the fact that you had 3 months where your business was shut down, and we're going to value your practice based on a February 29th, 2020 number, a pre-COVID number. And we're going to let you grow back into where you were pre-COVID. Many of our clients have already done that. But the structures that are being done today are far more creative than they were a year ago. And earnouts are a big component of this, when, in fact, in 2019, we probably had an earnout component in deals 10 to 20% of the time. Today, an earnout component is in every single deal, which provides upside for the doctors. Not only do they get to recoup their missing 3 months, but they also have significant upside if they can grow. So let's talk about what's happening now. Again, creative deal structure. And there are many buyers that have completely stopped buying at all. Two of the biggest DSOs in the country, one with 250 offices and one with 350 offices, used to be very active buyers. And in fact, between Jan 1 and September 1, they bought a total of 0 new practices. Fortunately, that slack was picked up by the smaller DSOs. And in fact, during this period of time, we have had multiple DSOs die. It is not done yet, but we've had multiple groups who functionally handed their keys to their lenders and walked away. And those are the guys, obviously, you want to avoid. You know, the key to the long-term value in any transaction is who your partner is and how is that going to help you grow your retained ownership interest over time.
Well, folks, I think Chip's cell phone dropped his connection. He's dialing back in right now.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Fantastic. I apologize, guys. That's what happens when you hit the mute button to take a drink of water and instead hit the disconnect button. So we can't blame the cell carrier. We blame the idiot operator, mate. I apologize. Let's talk about timing for transactions. Historically, pre-COVID, it would take about 6 months from the time someone became our client to them putting cash in their pockets. Sometimes it was shorter, sometimes it was longer, sometimes it was a lot longer. Hawaii was a good example of a lot longer. It took us about 18 months to get that transaction done. Fortunately, that's not normal. But during COVID, it's been really interesting in that some transactions have been done faster. The highest speed deals that we have done in our multi-year history have been done in the last 6 months. Some of these buyers are very eager to get transactions closed. And so that's been a good thing for doctors. You know, values change on a regular basis. 2 years ago, we would not have taken an endo client because we didn't know who the buyer would be. Today, not only are the endo-only buyers interested, but the multi-specialty groups that own all specialties and GP are also very eager. And that just gives you an idea of how things change in this business. Another good example, in 2018, we sold over $100 million in orthodontic practices to 5 specific groups. By June of 19, those 5 groups were buying no more ortho practices at all. And so obviously that changes the ability to get multiple bidders and therefore changes value. So one of the questions that we get a lot is, you know what, maybe I'll just wait and maybe my practice will be worth more in the future. We don't think that is the case. Part of it is because the number of doctors that are interested in this concept has gone up dramatically. As I said in a previous slide, we've signed over $370 million in new clients since April. And that has been a great thing, but it points out that doctors are very interested in this concept. And there are therefore more practices available for the invisible DSOs to choose from. And therefore, that potentially puts pressure on prices. I also believe that, again, tax rates are going up. And if they do, I think that will change the dynamics of values. One of the interesting things about the DSO business, and virtually all new DSOs that are being formed are invisible DSOs. They have grasped the concept that a national brand does not necessarily add value, and that doctors who they want to be their partners are very interested in retaining their local brand value and basically keeping it a secret from the community that they now have a new well-financed partner. So the groups that are getting into the invisible DSO business, everybody talks about private equity-backed DSOs, and so the major ones, such as Heartland, for instance, is private equity-backed, and most of the major ones are. But the family office-backed invisible DSOs is growing dramatically, and a group called SBICs are also getting into it. We've done a number of transactions with SBIC-backed ISDOs. And an SBIC is functionally a private equity firm that gets federally guaranteed money as part of their investor pool. And they've become very enamored with the dental market. This just talks a little bit about private equity. Many people think that 1.2 trillion in dry powder is low and that it should be more like 1.5 or 1.6. But in any case, there is a lot of money interested in the dental concept because there are a lot of groups that have made a lot of money in dental. But things do change. For those of you who are old enough to remember September of 2008 to June of 2010, or actually longer than that, you really couldn't sell a practice for cash. Certainly you could sell it to your associate and finance it, but the banks were not lending, the private equity groups were not buying, and there were a few that were, but not many. And back then, if you had an interest in monetizing your practice, which in most people's case is their largest single asset, you didn't have an option. You were stuck. And that happens. Is that going to happen again in the future? We certainly hope not, because it's not good for our business. But is it possible? Yeah, it is. Fortunately, the values today are extraordinary. Depending on the size of your practice, it could be worth a lot more than you think it is. And when I say size, practices are valued based on their operating income. And that operating income is described as EBITDA, or earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. And another way to describe EBITDA is cash flow, but it's always after doctor compensation. I have conversations with doctors who go, well, my accountant told me my EBITDA was $1 million. And I'm like, yep, your EBITDA is $1 million if you want to get paid nothing. But the reality is you have to factor in the cost to pay the doctor, whether he was an owner or not, to continue doing what the doctor does. And therefore, EBITDA is not the operating profit of the practice before paying the doctor. EBITDA is after doctor compensation, and that's an important distinction to remember. So there are functionally two basic types of buyers, the invisible DSOs and the rebranding buyers. Again, the invisible DSO category is growing faster. Heartland has admonished me multiple times, and I apologize, that saying that they're actually an invisible DSO, not a rebrander, because they keep the doctor's brand. So I apologize to Heartland that I need to fix my slide. So they have different approaches into how they structure deals, and every transaction is custom based on what the doctor wants. We worked on a transaction last month where one of the 3 doctors in a group of oral surgeons wanted to take a 1-year sabbatical sort of in the middle of his 5-year commitment, and we were able to work around that and get it to happen. But in a rebranding buyer, typically you're going to sell 100% of the practice, you're going to continue to work for X years, and they're going to take over the management of the practice, and you're going to do dentistry, get paid, and go home. With the invisible DSOs, they expect you to stay. The number of years that they want you to stay is variable. And it will impact value. If a doctor is 42 years old and says he wants to stay for 20 years, he's going to be more valuable than the doctor who's 62 years old and wants to stay for 2 years. So every transaction is possible, but different things impact value. The invisible DSOs are interesting in that they probably already own parts of practices in your community, but you may not know it. And they can provide resources to these practices that are outside of just referrals from other groups in their network. But they also have the ability to buy products less expensively. They pay less for benefits than you do. And they have the ability to negotiate higher reimbursement rates due to their size than you do. And so that can be a daunting challenge across any specialty or any GP for that matter, because when somebody big and powerful comes to your community, they can do things differently. This is pretty self-explanatory, but the invisible DSO model is built around the concept of owner doctors. They want owner doctors who have a motivation to continue to work, to continue to grow. They're not going to ask you to work any harder than you are already working. That is an interesting question we get a lot. If you're taking 6 months off a year and producing the numbers you're producing, they're going to be fine with you taking 6 months off per year in the future. And if you're working 3 days a week or 4 days a week or 2 days a week, doesn't matter. What they're looking for is you to continue doing what you did to successfully build your practice. They are not going to force you or ask you to work longer hours. You may want to because you may have cash incentives to do that, but it's not a requirement. So let's talk about basic deal structures. In our typical transaction, the doctors are selling 70% of their practice for cash, and they're retaining 30% ownership either in the practice or in the parent, but they're all over the map. It depends on what the doctor wants. In multi-doctor practices, each doctor can get a different consideration package. We see it a lot in oral surgery where you have a 5-doctor oral surgery group. The eldest doctor is 65 and the youngest doctor is 34, and each of those have different financial goals. The 65-year-old doctor is interested in more rapid liquidity and potentially even retiring as a part of the transaction. So he may do a transaction where he gets all cash at closing and retires the day after closing, which is fine. And on the other side, you may have the 34-year-old doctor who said, wait a minute, I'm 34, I'm going to practice another 25 years. How does this benefit me? Well, the answer is the 34-year-old doctor not only gets cash up front, secures his financial future, but he gets the opportunity to benefit from the increase in the equity value of his retained ownership over the 10 or 25 period he may be working. So for the younger doctors versus the older doctors, the consideration in each transaction can be different based on the doctor's goals. This is pretty self-explanatory. The most important bullet in this is that these groups all want your associates to ultimately have a path to ownership if you want them to. We get that question a lot in groups where they say, you know, I've got 3 owners and 4 associates. You know, what happens to my 4 associates? Well, the answer is ultimately they believe those 4 associates are going to be the replacement for the 3 owner doctors as they retire out. So virtually every one of these groups is going to create a path to ownership for your current and future associates. This is particularly challenging or particularly important in the specialist business because it's tough to recruit a great specialist to join your team unless you have the ability to offer them ownership either up front or at some time in the future. And so all of these groups are cognizant of that and will create paths to ownership for any associate, whether it's current or future, if you want them to. Let's go back to the topic of EBITDA. EBITDA is an interesting number because it's defined differently by everybody, and it's really defined differently by potential buyers. So this is an actual example of a real practice, 3 different buyers, all qualified buyers to which we had sold practices historically. And this was their calculation of the operating profit of that practice. And the difference is each buyer uses different metrics. So for example, there's one group out there who uses a flat number for lab and supplies expense. And so if your lab and supplies expense is higher than theirs, that's probably good for you because they're going to use a lower number, which is their cost of supplies and labs, to calculate your EBITDA. There are other groups, for instance, in the oral surgery business or in the implant business where they will look at a doctor and say, hey, you're paying $275 for a Straumann implant, and we're paying $110 for that same Straumann implant, so there's a $165 delta. We're going to give you the benefit of that because we know that if you become our partner, we're going to cut your cost on that implant by $165. We had one prospective client who was doing 4,000 implants a year, and so that made about a $650,000 swing in his EBITDA, which resulted in about a $5 million swing in his purchase price. So the buyer who was willing to give them credit for their cost of implants versus the doctor's cost of implants was able to pay $5 million more for that practice than the other buyers. So calculating EBITDA is a lot more complex than your accountant thinks it is. Employment agreements are an interesting topic in this business because some doctors go into these transactions or perceive these transactions with the belief that their potential partner wants to get rid of them and replace them, in theory, with somebody less expensive. The reality is the exact opposite. There's not an invisible DSO out there that wouldn't be thrilled to sign a 15-year contract with you. And the contracts are pretty clear, if you negotiate them correctly, that you can't be fired unless your production drops by 50% or you're convicted of a felony. And that's not charged with a felony, that's convicted of a felony. So the reality is they want you to stick around forever, and they are going to do anything they can to make sure you do stick around. So let's talk about how you get paid. Any respectable invisible DSO is going to pay anywhere between 60 and 90% of the transaction in cash upfront. Today, there will probably be a COVID holdback such that some percentage of that cash is withheld and given to the doctor when the practice has returned to pre-COVID either production or EBITDA levels, and it'll depend on the buyer. COVID holdbacks are beginning to go away as a number of our clients are already above where they were in 2019. So we're seeing more transactions that don't have a COVID holdback. But if your practice is not back up above year over year where you were last year, you're going to have a COVID holdback. The equity is really where the upside in these transactions lies. When you retain equity, either in the practice or the parent, you have the potential to benefit from the same upside that your new partner is hoping to get. And frankly, this is a business of arbitrage. Last year, the average DSO that recapitalized, and we'll call them a DSO, was at least $100 million in revenues. The value of that DSO was about 13 times EBITDA. The average transaction for the average doctor that is acquired through our process is about 6.5 times EBITDA. So if you have a practice with $1 million in EBITDA, depending on how you define it, depending on where you are and your growth rate and your age and a lot of other things, you can figure on an EBITDA value of 6 times EBITDA. The larger the practice in the right area and perhaps with complementary practices nearby that the buyer can buy at the same time, we've done transactions this year above 10 times EBITDA. But their business is a game of arbitrage. If they can buy a practice at 6 times EBITDA and sell their group or recapitalize their group at 13 times EBITDA, there's a lot of money being made there. And given the fact that they are using leverage right now because debt is very inexpensive, it magnifies the return on the equity investment. So one of the keys to these transactions is understanding what equity you want, what equity you can get, what the exit for that equity is, because in some of these transactions, the groups will ask you to hold the equity forever, which is fine, but if you have an interest in liquefying your retained equity, you need to have a mechanism for that in whatever contract you negotiate. So let's talk about the pluses and minuses of various equity levels. If you keep equity at the practice level, you're in control of your destiny because the upside of your practice is functionally dictated by you. If you keep equity at the parent level, you're getting to diversify your risk. In other words, it's not all based on you, it's based on a group of practices that are functionally your partners through the parent company. So each of these levels has various risks and rewards, and a lot of it depends on the partner and ultimately who your partner's backer is. There are a number of private equity groups that have owned multiple DSOs over the years and have been very successful at monetizing them, benefiting not only themselves, but their doctor partners. So fully understanding who your partner is and understanding your structure and understanding who your partner's backer is extremely important to the success in these transactions. So let's talk about what creates value for a practice. The most important thing in creating value for your practice, unfortunately, you are not in control of, which is where you are. And this will change. We sold the largest orthodontists in Montana and Wyoming last year for an extraordinary value. And those are the last two states in the U.S. to have a DSO. And that has worked out fantastically for both the buyer and the doctors, as that buyer has now acquired practices from us in Utah and Idaho and Texas. So they've expanded their footprint, increasing the value of the Montana and Wyoming doctors' retained equity. And this map will change literally monthly. Right now, there are places that have been consistently hot and continue to be hot, and those are really Texas, Tennessee, Florida, South Carolina, and Georgia. North Carolina, for those of you who are there, North Carolina is challenging because the North Carolina Dental Board makes it very difficult for a new group to come into the state. So if you're interested in doing a transaction in the next 12 months, you need to go with one of the existing invisible DSOs that's already licensed in North Carolina. And that changes as more and more are becoming licensed. But to become licensed in North Carolina, it is at least $1 million in legal fees and about a year process. So that makes North Carolina an interesting market. Delaware is another interesting market in that they very much limit doctors who can become licensed in Delaware. And so it is a virtual monopoly for those who are there, but the challenge is that their practices are effectively unsellable. So every state is different, and again, it changes. I can tell you that 6 months ago, California was very hard, but there are multiple groups now interested in California. One of the larger pedo-ortho groups I talked to today, and they announced that while they had never crossed the Mississippi, they were ready to go to California. So it literally changes that fast. Fortunately, we have a bunch of great ortho clients in California that they will get to look at, but it literally changes that fast, that they could be interested in Texas today, but not in Texas tomorrow. So if you're in one of these states, your practice is sellable. The value will be different, and the number of bidders that you have will be different. Louisiana, for instance, is particularly unpopular right now due to their fifth hurricane. And Florida changes based on their hurricanes. And California, Northern California in particular, changes based on its fires. So let's talk about ways to create value. The larger your EBITDA, the more likely you can become a platform. A platform is a practice that gives somebody a reason to come into the state or into the region and to become your partner or buy an interest in your practice because they see you as a place from which they can expand. If you are, so for instance, I was on the phone today with a large 20 million in collections practice in New England. And while there would be multiple groups that are already in New England that would be interested in his practice, he's going to get a higher value by being the first entry into New England from a group that's not there yet. His practice is big enough to become a platform and attract multiple bidders at a higher value than he might get selling to the groups that are already in New England. Let's talk about age for a second. Younger doctors are very exciting for these groups. They're looking for builders. And so when you have a young doctor who's built a big practice, they believe that if that doctor is interested, they can put their money behind that doctor and help him build a much larger empire. And that might be by de novos, it might be expanding existing practice or practices, and it might be by acquiring complementary or even competitive practices. And they're very interested in growth, and they will put the money behind that growth. And for the doctors that are young, it's a great opportunity to build an empire with no risk because you're using your partner's capital, but you can still have ownership up to 40% in those practices that you buy, build, or expand. So it's a really interesting way to grow with no risk and create much larger long-term value than trying to do it yourself. Because not only do you have access to their capital, you have access to their management systems, you have access to their payer relationships. You're going to be doing it with lower cost of goods from a supplies and team benefits perspective. And frankly, most importantly, you're going to benefit from their marketing. The dentistry business, in particular orthodontics, has become a very consumer marketing driven business. Orthos can no longer rely exclusively on referrals from other doctors. because you have doctors that are now doing Invisalign and some are doing conventional braces, and therefore they're not referring but rather keeping that business. Any orthodontist in this country who has not mastered direct-to-consumer marketing has a business that is going to have challenges. They may not have it today, but it's coming. And so these groups that own multiple orthodontists across the country have become very adept at marketing directly to the consumer to drive new patients to their affiliated practices. And they do a really good job at it. I always tell orthos the number one reason to join an invisible DSO is because of the fact that you're going to benefit from their proven marketing. And if you join the right one, you may benefit from the fact that they also own pedos in your neighborhood. Identifying complementary acquisitions in a neighborhood is really important, and that's something we do. So, for instance, we just signed a new oral surgery client in Portland, Oregon recently, and we have already contacted every pedo, every ortho, and every other oral surgeon in the area because we can potentially increase the value of our client there by having multiple clients that would be complementary and thus attract somebody new to the area to buy all of our clients, including pedos, orthos, and our original oral surgery client at the same time. And when you can create a bigger bite like that, you can get higher values and attract more prospective bidders. We would not be successful in just marketing his single oral surgery practice standalone, and we would not get the kind of values we like to get for our clients. So that's one of the things that we do to help increase our clients' values. Let's talk about value detractors. Probably the number one value detractor on here is sloppy, slow financials. If you're not looking at your financials within 15 days of the end of the month, you need to fix that. Because you should know what your numbers are. You should be looking at your numbers. You should be managing your practice by your numbers. And when we get clients who can't give us, last month's reports within a couple of weeks, we get very concerned because the buyers are interested in updated financials. And when we have a client who doesn't have them, the buyers become a lot less interested real quickly. As far as new technologies goes, this does not mean you need to be on the bleeding edge and have every new toy that came out last year. It just means you need to have the basic technologies updated and utilized within your practice. It doesn't mean you need to have a CEREC system. Doesn't mean you need to have a gentle wave in endo. It just means that you need to be at least fairly current. We've had clients who didn't even have computers. So having current technologies is important. Again, nothing you can control, but flood or fire-prone areas are becoming more difficult. You've seen it obviously in Louisiana and California, and now parts of Colorado have fire issues. Again, nothing you can do to control it, but it could potentially impact your value longer term. And it's not just about a specific community, it's about regions. And I can tell you that the areas where the California fires are going on, practices are worth less there today than they were. Ortho is an interesting topic as it pertains to adults. The investors in the various big invisible DSOs can look back to 2008, 2009 and see what happened to adult ortho. And it declined precipitously. They're very concerned that as the recession continues, adult ortho will become less attractive. And they believe that kids will continue to get ortho treatment, but adults may postpone it due to economic pressures. So if you give me a practice that's 60% adult ortho, it's going to be less valuable than the practice that's 80% kids ortho. Unaddressed credit balances. This is a real world example of an orthodontic client that we had a couple of years ago who had not returned overpayments from insurance companies and had not returned deposits to patients in a timely manner. And it became an absolute nightmare at closing to calculate the fees and penalties that ortho owed to the state. Because it says if you don't repay your credit balances to either the insurance company or the patients within X period of time, and it depends on the state, you're required to pay those funds into the state. And if you don't, it's just like the IRS, they will assess fees and penalties for your failure to do that. And in this particular practice, they had not returned credit balances going back over 10 years. So the exercise of calculating the penalties and interest due, and it's not just to the state in which the practice operates, it's required to the states in which the insurance companies are domiciled. So in this particular case, they owed funds back to groups in 11 different states. So there's a whole lot of math in calculating the interest and penalties across 11 states for some credit balances that could have been outstanding for 10 years. So if you have unrepaid credit balances, I highly urge you before you go into any type of process to fix that issue now, because it becomes a nightmare later. Let's talk about real estate. Doctors functionally have two choices if they own their practice real estate when they enter into one of these transactions. In any case, your new partner is going to lease that property that you are in, and they will lease it from you if you're the owner, or they'll lease it from somebody else who becomes the owner. And there's the potential to increase the value of your real estate significantly because of the quality of the tenant that is now going to be on the lease of your property. So when you sign up with one of these partners, they are typically AAA credit. Not that your credit is bad, but the people who are interested in buying these properties, and there are dozens of them out there, they are interested in having a AAA credit DSO tenant more than they are having you as the tenant. So functionally, you have two choices. You can continue to lease your property to a AAA credit tenant who's going to pay you rent for the next 10 or 20 years, or you can sign a lease with your partner, or your new partner, and then sell that real estate to a real estate investment trust or other types of investors. And it potentially unlocks significant value for you, and it becomes an important part of the lease that you negotiate in one of these transactions. Because we have done transactions where we've actually increased the rate of the rent above what had been paid historically, so that it would increase the amount of income going into the doctor's real estate entity, because he had losses within that entity. So he was functionally able to shelter part of his practice transaction value in an entity that had tax losses. And so he reduced his tax bill by several $100,000. And that's just one of the pieces of the puzzle that you need to understand when you do one of these transactions, because there can be big pluses and big minuses to doing it. The invisible DSOs will target an area. So again, I'm going to use Portland, Oregon as an example, because we have a new oral surgery client there. I can tell you that the pedos, orthos, and oral surgeons in Portland, Oregon just increased in value by 10 to 15%, only because we will be bringing multiple invisible DSOs to bid on our initial client there, the oral surgeon, and then our follow-on clients, the pedos and orthos. So if you are interested in this concept, you want to make sure that you're in touch with us and that your numbers are current, because we don't want to call you and go, hey, we've got a great buyer who's interested in Portland, Oregon, and you should become a client because they're interested in looking at you. And if you say, it's going to take me 90 days to get my numbers straightened out, you're going to miss an opportunity. And that is happening more and more, particularly in the orthopedo oral surgery. It's less so in the other specialties because you don't have that built-in referral network. You know, a lot of people ask me about endos do I want to sell my endo practice to a multi-specialty group that owns GPs in my area? That's a double-edged sword. You may pick up the referrals from your new partner's GPs in the area, but you also may irritate other referral sources to you that compete with your new partner's GPs. So it's very important to fully understand what you're doing as it pertains to potential referral sources. You know, we always talk to doctors and say, hey, it's great to have a plan as to how you want to grow your practice, not just now, but when you have a new partner who has resources that can help you grow. And this is a client of ours who's a very large GP. We're in the middle of closing his transaction. But he built his business in 4 years by making 84 acquisitions of smaller practices, consolidating them into 45 offices, and built a heck of a business. And he came to us and said, "Hey, I'm interested in doing this on a bigger scale go forward, because I believe that our current recession is going to extend for a while, and therefore there's going to be the opportunity to buy a lot of practices. And I would really like to have a partner to do that." And so we found him a partner, and he'll probably acquire, I don't know, 30 practices in the next 12 months with his new partner and expand his footprint and grow his business. And fortunately, he runs a very profitable practice. One of the things that we're seeing out there, and he has taken advantage of it 5 times already during COVID, is you have older doctors that are, we'll call it 60 to 65 or older, and who have decided that, you know what, their retirement is funded. This COVID thing is really not that much fun. I just want to get out. And those practices, let's call it a million in collections practices, is functionally very challenging to sell today, because the associates coming out of school don't have the ability to borrow the money to buy from you. Therefore, you end up having to finance them, which means you might as well have not sold it. And the associates today have different views of the world than they might have had 10 years ago. And your dentists, you have your own opinions on this, but there is over half the graduates coming out of dental school today are going to work for DSOs. They like having a regular income. They like having a solid partner. And so that is changing the pool of potential associates to buy in or buy all of your practice. So we're seeing transactions more regularly. We're not involved with them because they're not what we do, but where doctors are basically saying to other doctors, "Here, if you'll take over my lease and keep employing my team members and take care of my patients, you can have my practice. It's free." And again, our client who's described here has picked up 5 practices that way since the beginning of COVID. So what we do is our business model is pretty simple. When a client becomes our client, they are going to pay us a percentage of what they get when they get it. And it's important to us to try and maximize that percentage, not only because it's in the best interest of our clients, but clearly, since we're getting a percentage of what you get, it's in our best interest to increase what you get. We're also very cautious on tax optimization. Fortunately, my partner is not just a lawyer, but he also has a master's degree in tax. And although we don't give tax advice to our clients, we're pretty good at coming up with structures that help maximize the tax optimization for our clients. We always have our clients hire outside counsel and outside tax advisors, but these structures can be changed to be tax advantageous. Our fee is also kind of interesting in that most of the folks in our position get paid both from buyers and sellers. They often don't bother to tell you that, but you have a very strong conflict of interest when the person who's supposed to be representing you is also getting paid on the other side of the transaction. And our approach to this is pretty simple. We will take you on as a client if we believe we can get you a value that is agreeable to you. And you pay absolutely nothing unless we're successful in doing that. So we get paid at closing if there's a closing, and if there's not a closing, we get paid nothing. We believe that today is a temporary opportunity. The good news is the values for great practices is equal to or higher than 2019 in most cases. And what you're going to have to show is post-crisis growth to get the best value. Whether you're interested in monetizing your practice today or a year from today, your post-crisis growth is critical. One of the nice things about doing a transaction today, we believe values are high today. We certainly hope they go higher, but we're not sure that's going to happen. And you're able to lock in today's high values for your future exit on that retained equity at today's high value levels. So for instance, when we factor in a put option, meaning the doctor has the right to force his partner to repurchase his equity at some point in the future, we get to use today's value multiples to come up with that formula. And today's value multiples are high. So kind of a nice thing to do. Our process is pretty simple. We want to talk to every doctor out there. And what we do is we schedule a call between me and a prospective doctor and get to know each other in about a 20-minute introductory call. If that's of interest, then we're going to provide you with a non-disclosure agreement so that our conversations can be kept confidential. And then we're going to take a look at P&L statements from the last 3 years. We don't need tax returns. We're just interested in profit and loss statements. And then we're going to have a conversation with you about those to understand, as we call it, where the bodies are buried. Because keep in mind, yes, you can add back all the personal expenses, and we dig real hard to find those. And then once we've done that, you and I will have another conversation, and I will give you our view of what your operating income is and therefore what your potential value is. In the meantime, we will have researched the area that you're in to be able to come up with a pretty close value. So our values are based on market values, other transactions similar to yours that have occurred in the area with particular buyers that we know are still active. And so when we come up with a value of a practice, some doctors are thrilled and some doctors are not thrilled, but we're just reporting the news. We would love to talk to every doctor. We enjoy doing this. We look at hundreds and hundreds of practice financials each year. And worst case, you're going to learn something. Worst case, you can understand what the value of your practice is. And as a sideline to that, you'll get our commentary, and all of our analysts are former practice consultants. And so they have a pretty good idea of a practice that's well run, and they have a pretty good idea of ways that practices can be better run. And so in the worst case, you've gotten a free valuation and you have some ideas on how you can improve your practice on a go-forward basis, even if you're not interested in doing a transaction. And with that, I will shut up and take questions. And thank you again for your time.
Thank you, Chip. I have some questions, but before I get to those, I'd like again to invite our viewers to use the question box in your control panel to ask any questions that you have. First question, Chip, what happens to my team members?
Great question. The answer is your team members are your team members, and they expect you to manage, lead, hire, and fire them. Not in all cases. There are some doctors who are like, look, I don't want to deal with my team, and there are groups out there that will solve that problem, but not all of them. But the answer is they're your team members. They're valuable to you. They want you to continue to manage and lead them.
Okay. Second question, who makes the clinical decisions post-affiliation?
In every single case, thanks to laws, all doctors make all clinical decisions. The DSOs are not in the business of dictating clinical procedures.
Okay, that ties into my next question. Do I have to use specific vendors or specific dental supplies or suppliers?
No, in most cases, they want you to continue using whatever your favorite brand of supplies or aligners or tools, whatever it is. But they may suggest that they can buy that exact same brand through their larger group purchasing systems, and they will suggest that you do that. But they will not say, in ortho, for instance, hey, you're using Damon brackets, you need to switch to XYZ brackets. They're not in that business. And we always see it in gloves. Every doctor I think we've ever had says, well, can I keep using the brand XYZ gloves? And the answer is yes. They just may be able to buy whatever it is that you want cheaper.
Okay. Will an invisible DSO help me build another location?
Yeah, absolutely. If that's what you want to do and you're interested in doing that, you bet they will. Right now, they're going to urge you to go buy competitors rather than doing de novo locations. But yes, they will.
Okay, we have time for one more question, and it is, I am planning on purchasing a piece of equipment prior to year's end. Should I still do that?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, thank you everyone for these questions, but we've run out of time today. So if we did not get to your question, we will answer it after the webinar via email. Be sure to take the free CE quiz associated with this webinar, and shortly we will be sending you a recording of this presentation and instructions on how to access the CE quiz. Thank you all again for attending. A special thank you to Chip Fichtner, who did a great job, and our sponsor for this webinar, Large Practice Sales. Thank you, goodbye, and stay safe out there.
Thank you.